Now, so good afternoon, everyone, and this first edition of the, I'm going to call it the Leeds Lockdown Lowdown, 3 Ls. This is a series of interviews and webinars organised by Leeds Civic Trust. By the way, my name is Martin Hamilton. I'm Director of Leeds Civic Trust. So we've organised these to take place throughout June. And really, the idea is for us to talk to a variety of key figures in the city, but really with a focus on how do we actually come out of the current COVID-19 situation. So that's very much the angle that we're trying to address with these interviews. Just to say before I go any further that we have a number of other interviews confirmed during the course of June. So Rachel Reeves MP, we're interviewing her on Friday. So if you haven't booked in for that one, do go on Eventbrite and find that one. She, of course, is now in the shadow cabinet and is shadowing Michael Gove. So at a national level, she's been very much involved in the debate and discussion about COVID-19, but I'm sure she'll have a lot of interesting things to say about how we come out of the current crisis and how that will affect Leeds in particular. We then next week shortly going to advertise an event looking at climate and climate emergency. So we've got people from Our Future Leeds, from the youth strike, from people representing air quality interests. That will be a larger panel, and that will be very much focusing on climate. Again, with the issue about how do we actually address the current, how do we approach that differently now that we have this COVID-19 issue in the background. Future events will include speakers on property and development and how that might be affected. We've got Andrew Cooper, the director of the Leeds Bid, lined up to speak later in the month. We're also going to be looking at the Year of Culture, the 2023 Year of Culture with the Culture team. So really we've got a variety of speakers covering a variety of topics. But I wanted to start really with Cllr Judith Blake, who joins us this afternoon. Judith Blake has been a councillor for a number of years and has been leader of the Leeds City Council for, I think, 6 years. Is that right, Judith? 5 years. Counting them all down. But I wanted to talk to Judith because, of course, how we come out of the current crisis is a real issue, I think, for the city and for Leeds City Council. And so I wanted to start off, Judith, by, sorry, I should also say we have the chat function enabled. So if anyone has any comments they want to make throughout the discussion, please feel free to comment. And we'll try and pick up some of those comments and I'll try and convert them into questions for Judith. But thanks to the questions that you've already sent in, I've got a couple that I've tried to incorporate into the remarks that I'm going to make, and hopefully Judith can respond to those. I wanted to start off, Judith, by just asking you a general question really about the last 3 months and how that has affected the way in which Leeds City Council operates as an organisation. And in particular, what do you think it shows about local government at its best, but also what has been challenging, particularly challenging? What has it brought out, in this difficult situation that maybe needs to change?
Thank you, Martin, and hello everyone, and thank you for organising this series of events, Martin, and to all of your team who are keeping your presence very much alive on social media, and I think it's very much appreciated by many people in the city. Well, when you asked me to do this, of course, it gave me a moment of space to just reflect a little bit on what the last 3 months have meant, and it's really interesting to me to think about. And I think what I'd say overall is we've been able to do what we've done so far because of the strength of the relationships and the partnerships that we've got in the city. And as you know, these go back a long way, they're very deep. And we've been able to rely on so many different people to help us through different circumstances, whether it was the financial crisis in 2009, the flooding episodes that we've had, so many different things that face us as a city. So we started to pick up the enormity of what was coming our way quite early on, and obviously we've got very close links to the Far East, in not just in China but other countries as well, and we were beginning to realize very early on that the significance of what was coming our way. And I think that helped us to move ahead, if you like, in terms of preparation. So I think a lot of you will have realized that Leeds was the first city to do some of the things that came before the actual lockdown period, sort of closing down playgrounds in our parks, for example, but also from a council organisation point of view. We very quickly got to a point where we could, at any one time, have 8,000 members of staff or members using our IT system at any one time during the day, and started to set up and enable the remote working mechanisms, which has really kept us going. So massive operation. The council staff absolutely extraordinary in their dedication, and so many of them have been working right through the whole crisis without taking a break, working weekends, long evenings, really doing incredible things. I mean, locking down a city is a massive undertaking, as you're aware. Many sections of our community took action themselves. So actually, large number of parents, for example, withdrew their children from school before the government announced that schools were going to be closing. A lot of businesses started to encourage people to work from home as well, all of these things. But in terms of, we have seen the best of what we can do locally through the crisis. And our response, whether it's been in terms of getting business grants out of the door, helping with advice for business, really establishing an incredible service to get that communicated and enacted, and, as I say, speed of the essence to help people. We've actually paid out over £4 million in grants in Leeds alone, which gives you the sort of a picture of what we've been dealing with. Moving our rough sleepers into emergency accommodation. Over 200 people chose to come in, and we set up a helpline, which we've received nearly 2,000 calls, and then all of the operation around delivering food, over nearly 5,000 food parcels going out, and keeping people informed and communicating with them, sending out bulletins, and actually deciding to write to every single household in the city, because we know while social media has its place, it doesn't reach everyone, and very often, in terms of the most vulnerable, they're the ones that probably don't have access, and that triggered an enormous response from that. So I think the frustration, if I can be honest, is that Whitehall runs very much with a command and control model and likes to run things from the centre. And unfortunately, we have seen repeatedly attempts to mobilise response nationally, which we know we could have done more successfully and at greater speed locally. So that, for example, all of the awful situation we've had with PPE, meaning that really vulnerable workers have not been able to have the protection that they needed right at the beginning and going through. Testing, trying to run the shielded cohort information from the centre is just not the best way to do things. So actually one of the last events that I did before we started going into lockdown was signing the devolution deal for West Yorkshire. And I think, for all of us across West Yorkshire in so many of these areas, I think, you know, now we really feel, you know, bring it on, devolution must continue. We really need to keep the timetable going, and get more resource and more powers down to us at a local level, so that we can be far more responsive at a local level and have the resource. But we are in a very difficult place, and obviously today, of course, is a very significant day in terms of a bit of a step change in terms of easing the lockdown. And you'll have heard reflected that, relatively speaking, going into lockdown is an easier task than actually coming out of it. And I think that is certainly what we're experiencing. But so many reflections to make, to think about what it was actually like in the city during lockdown, just the sheer, you know, being able to feel the difference in the air quality and taste it, and, you know, the blue skies. I know it's been incredible weather, but the quality of the air has just been so transformed. And all, you know, all of the things we've learned about working from home, all of the different technology, the different, you know, the fact that we're doing this conference today, all of that existed before, but we didn't have the confidence to use it. And I think for so many people, it's given people a real chance to assess their priorities in terms of how they've been living up until the crisis and what they would choose to do differently if they could. And I think that this is the really important things to take forward, but all the time remembering all those people who have been affected, people who have died, families who've been traumatized by what's happened, and people who have had the disease and, I'm afraid, will continue to bear the after shocks, if you like, with their health for some time to come. So I think what we're really looking at now, Martin, is in the short to medium term, is how, as a city, we move forward, and in the sort of way of learning to live with the virus, the fact that the virus is still out there in our communities, and we won't be sure that we've got the measure of it until we have a vaccine, and we have no idea when that'll be. So all of the measures that we're bringing in are still around safety and keeping people safe, and that is at the forefront of everything that we're doing at the moment, whilst balancing that with the awful impact on the economy, and recognizing those areas that have the highest inequalities and the highest vulnerabilities are the areas that have been hit hardest by the virus. And if anything has shown us how misplaced the whole austerity agenda has been and the impact it's had on our public services, then this has been it. And I think together we need a collective endeavour to recognise what we value, what's important, what will help us get through this, and to work to make sure that government puts in place those measures that will enable us to move forward and do the things we need to do to support the city.
Thanks, Judith. I want to go into some of those issues in a little bit more detail, and I will come back to devolution and the elected mayor a little bit later, so hold that particular thought. But I mean, I think it seems to me there's the sort of the short term and the short to medium term, which is sort of this issue about when the vaccine comes, or when things are completely safe, and that is a bit of an unknown at the moment. So there's that sort of period, and what action we take as a city to sort of be safe and to continue to be able to be active citizens, if you like. Then there's the longer term, isn't there, which goes back to some of these broader issues that Leeds was already looking at in terms of climate emergency, in terms of our transport system, issues that haven't gone away, but where COVID-19 may have changed our approach to this. So I wanted to ask you about transport to start off with. So we know that Leeds is receiving some funds, probably not very much money, but some funds from central government, the temporary measures to allow for people to, for pavements to be widened, for safety measures essentially, and that will obviously go so far, and we've seen some images of those on Twitter and in the newspapers. But then there's the longer term in terms of what we do as a city with our transport system. Clearly, at the moment, we're in a situation where people are not going back, particularly to work in the city centre, anytime soon in any great number. And even when things are eased off, maybe later in the summer, some organisations are saying that they physically can't accommodate a full set of people in their offices. So you might be talking Christmas before, you know, things are even remotely back to normal. That all has a knock-on effect on how transport is used. And we know that people are being put off from using public transport at the moment, which is counter to the council's previous message about trying to double our bus patronage and all the rest of it. So I guess the question really is, we know about the temporary measures, we know that things are being put in place around schools on a pilot basis, which is positive, but actually, is this an opportunity? I mean, they say, don't waste a crisis. You know, is this an opportunity to take some slightly more radical action to make the sorts of changes that perhaps politicians wouldn't think were acceptable in normal times, but actually now are acceptable, and you know, to think some of those long-term, you know, radical thoughts about transport that perhaps 3 months ago we hadn't thought about.
So there's a lot in that, Martin.
There is.
So we're grappling with a whole range of issues, as you can imagine, and obviously the viability of our public transport systems at the moment is pretty high on our agenda, and government are giving support to our bus companies, for example, but they're not at the moment giving the support to us as a local transport authority, to WICA, to enable us to work on the connections going forward. So I think that's a major issue. I've just been on a call with Transport for the North, actually, talking about rail. And at the moment, I think what you said is absolutely right, that in the main, people haven't got the confidence to go back onto public transport, and the rail numbers are low. I know LNER and other companies are bringing in a system similar to Europe, where you can only get on a train if you have a seat booked. That massive difference to where we were before, with people being rammed on the train, paying a fortune for a ticket, and you might have to stand all the way to Birmingham, for example, which is a frequent occurrence. But having said that, I understand that the weekend, the trains going to the coast were absolutely rammed. So, you know, people behave in different ways and you can't always predict it. So there's a lot of concern. We need to work very, very closely with the trade unions, with the staff, to make sure that they've got the protection they need, they've got the confidence to run their services, they know exactly what is expected of people. We still don't know, for example, whether face masks are going to be compulsory on, you know, on the transport networks. These are the things that we need to know and have a very clear view on. And I think, you know, obviously working on towards, you know, really reducing carbon emissions before the crisis hit. To hear that message from Boris Johnson himself when talking about this phase that we're going into now, that people should use their cars rather than public transport, was quite a blow in many ways, however realistic and practical it is at the moment. But certainly it's generated a massive response in terms of, well, hang on a minute, you know, people have been walking, they have been cycling. This is the moment that we need to try and move forward on this agenda and really enable an active travel agenda to be in place. So as you mentioned, we have been putting in short-term measures and increasing the public realm space for pedestrians as well, which many people will have seen around the city. So there's space on pavements when shops reopen, so people can social distance, all of these things. But I think one of the disappointing things for me, and I was talking about this with one of my colleagues, is that we had do you remember we had the citizens jury on the climate change agenda, and we've worked with the Climate Commission Leeds University to set up another one for transport. So I think this is really urgent that we use every means at our disposal, however difficult it is to actually physically meet people at the moment, to really get out and have that conversation with our residents, with people in our communities, and with business as well. Because what we know is that when we come forward with transport schemes, and we've had many coming forward, we are subject to a lot of objections. And as you know, as a Headingley resident, you know, the objections that we had to both Supertram and the NGT system, whatever you thought of those systems, they generated massive opposition from residents along that part of the line. So we have to as a city get much better at taking people with us when we're starting to propose changes that we need to make. But I think certainly in the short term.
Can I give you a couple of examples, Judith, and just quick examples of things that could be done, you know, certainly cheaply and probably very quickly, but would, I suppose, be an illustration of the council's the sense in which here's an opportunity to actually really push things forward. And I take your point about objections and the need to bring people with you. But for example, the council has already announced that really great plans to close City Square largely to traffic in time for 2023 Year of Culture. Now, the reason that can't happen any sooner is essentially because of the need to reroute city centre traffic around the gyratory, and those improvements need to be in place before that can happen. But at the moment, the traffic numbers are incredibly low. And even if people start to use their cars more than public transport, as I say, with changes in office use, I think there's probably a window of 6 months at least before the car use could get anything like up to the previous levels. So, you know, there's an opportunity, for example, to bring those changes to City Square immediately. That would be a statement that you know, here's an opportunity that we're grasping, and actually, while the traffic is quiet, people can see how something like that would work. We're not actually inconveniencing people because the traffic actually isn't there. That's one example of a fairly bold thing that is already on the cards but would be brought forward. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're right that we should look at all the schemes that we could bring forward, and you know, we were very keen to make sure that we carried on doing the works in the city centre when we were in lockdown as well, and we did get some concern and criticism about the fact that we were continuing with the work, but I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. None of these things can be done in isolation, though, Martin, as you know. So we have to make sure that everything works together as a package. But and what we have to do as well is make sure that we work with government to make sure that we have the funding coming through, and then the horrendous situation that we're facing in terms of the finances for the council. You know, these are huge issues that we have to address, and we'll be moving forward to the autumn, looking along with local authorities all over the country in terms of you know, how we are actually going to be able to set legal budgets by next year, such as the incredible loss to income that we're facing at the moment. So I don't want to promise anything here. It would just be completely wrong of me. But certainly, if we can do anything in it, sequence things differently to add to what we can do, then you know, we would try and do that if that's practically and financially possible to do so. But there are long lead-in times to these schemes, as you quite rightly say. So, to enable one scheme to take place, you have to look at the other schemes that enable that to happen. So it's a complex jigsaw of
issues.
And this is something
I accept that, yeah.
Take out to the public to actually help them to assess the priorities. But there are all sorts of other things that, why don't we look at establishing secure bike parks at transport nodes, or how we can actually get people to do the last part of their journey, walking or cycling, improving the walkways. We know that, not that long ago, people used to walk all over the city centre, and for whatever reasons, they've, road schemes have blocked access, or things have been neglected so people don't feel safe. And that's the sort of work that we need to work on immediately to unlock those safe walking distances. The distance that people have, if it was done well, the number of people who could really easily be within walking distance of Leeds City Square is immense. And those are the sort of matters that we need to bring in straight away where we can.
Okay, well that's good to hear, and certainly I think if at the moment people are deterred from getting the bus or getting the train, then at least if that car journey is shorter than it would otherwise be, and the last mile or so is a walk, then that would be better than driving into the city centre. Whereas you say, actually, there's an odd situation where some of the parking spaces in the city centre are being removed to free up space for pedestrians, to walk along some of our shopping streets. So the parking capacity is actually going to go down in the city centre in the short term. Could I ask one more question on transport before we move on to something else? And that's about the airport. So as people will know, there's a planning application in at the moment to revamp at Leeds Bradford Airport. They have ambitions to expand the number of flights, to change the arrangements in terms of overnight flying, which is always a controversial issue. I've had questions from people on both sides of this argument, actually. Leeds and Bradford Airport should be extended, it shouldn't be extended, it should be closed down, etc., etc. But the reality is that if you look at the airline industry as it is today, it's on its knees. I mean, Ryanair, I think something radical will have to happen in terms of government subsidy for these airlines to actually continue. So again, the situation 3 months ago maybe was quite different from the situation we have now. Putting in time and effort into improving an airport, expanding it, potentially looking at more flights at a time when the airline industry is on its knees. And I think people are saying it will take 5 years to recover to where it was previously. You could argue that it's an odd time to be looking at these issues now. It may not have been odd 3 months ago. So I suppose the question, Judith, is what is the council's position on the airport, and has it changed in the last 3 or 4 months?
So we haven't actually, it's difficult to say that the position has changed at the moment. As you can imagine, our focus has been entirely on dealing with the crisis, and we haven't had the opportunities to come together in the ways that we normally would. I mean, the situation as it stands at the moment is that the airport is obviously privately owned, and they've chosen to submit a planning application for a new terminal, which is their plan, and that is a live application. So we have to take that through the planning process, which is being consulted on at the moment, as I'm sure you're aware. I think the real issue that I've got, if I'm honest, because let's have this conversation within the context of the whole country. These issues are coming up at most of the airports around the country. So what we are completely lacking is that we have no national aviation strategy at all. There isn't one. There is no overarching strategy that we can all, as the different areas that have airports within them, can work towards. And I just think, I don't understand how that can be the case so far, but it certainly can't be allowed to continue. So we will continue to press government for that. We've had conversations about the airport before, and as you quite rightly say, you get a very strong view from environmentalists, people who don't want further disturbance from the airport in terms of extended hours, against people who, you know, many hundreds of people, into the thousands, who actually rely on the airport for their employment. So there is always a balance that we have to strike. But this is one area where we've been working very closely on with the Climate Commission, as you can imagine, in terms of the emissions and in terms of our ambitions around moving forward on the carbon agenda. So I just want to establish, I haven't had the opportunity personally to talk to the airport since in the last few weeks, what they really believe their business model is going to look like as a result of this. I haven't got that information, so I really do want to pick that up. And I'm sure you're aware, in terms of surface access, we've completely transformed and revised our plans in terms of the roads that had been considered that won't be taking place, and still working forward in terms of the rail halt on the Leeds to Harrogate line, which runs very close to the airport. And actually, if the planning permission for the terminal goes ahead, the terminal actually will physically be moving much closer to that rail halt, which would mean that it's a very short distance to travel across. But these are major issues that we need to resolve at pace. And just really, I don't think the assessment's really been done, Martin, in terms of what the crisis is actually going to mean to the aviation industry.
But I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Just watching the news, that the people again are going to take time to get people back on aircraft. They can only operate economically with a certain load, and we're nowhere near that. I mean, it's exactly the same with our buses. Will first bus be able to operate economically with a tenth of their normal passengers, because that's the requirement. So I agree, it's probably too early to come to a conclusion, but you would imagine that these discussions are probably happening at the airport and across the aviation industry, and you would have thought something's going to have to give.
Of course, British Airways made the decision just last week to withdraw their flights from Leeds Bradford. So
exactly.
It's very real, and it's happening now. I think one of the issues that's been discussed at great length as well, if it does, it does recover and people still want to travel by air, then they, reducing the services at Leeds Bradford won't necessarily have a direct impact on that. They'll move to a different airport, and as things stand at the moment, they'll probably choose to do those journeys by road, which a different argument. The argument that 3 months ago, the argument would be people will choose rail, whereas now at the moment people will choose the car. Things have changed. Things have gone on their head, haven't they? Really, yeah. So in terms of a very uncertain economic future, people's plans of upgrading their cars to maybe consider electric vehicles, we could find that all of that has been put on hold as well. But we have to put the alternatives in place, and look at different modes of travel, how we can actually make sure there is a credible alternative when things do recover, so that people, particularly for internal travel, don't need to travel by air.
I want to just touch on something that you well, really that issue and something you mentioned, which is the earlier on, which is the air, the clean, the quality of our air. I mean, I think it's interesting that one of the you know, can we call it a benefit? One of the side effects of what we've witnessed over the last 3 months has been far fewer vehicles on the road, and we've probably achieved as a city, I suspect, more than we would have achieved had the clean air zone been introduced. I mean, we've probably, you know, got cleaner air actually than we would have had with the CAS in place. Ironically, I mean, that's just the way things have gone. So could you sort of tell us about what the plans are now in terms of the clean air zone? And clearly that was delayed for obvious reasons, but could we, are there other measures that could be put in place in the meantime to try and keep this, you know, as long as possible until the alternatives are there, and if you like, until the disincentives are in place to actually keep us at the current level of air quality? You know, having more car-free days, for example. Someone suggesting on the chat here, something like that. You know, until the zone gets implemented.
We're open for those discussions, Martin. As I've said before, clearly it wasn't felt appropriate to bring the clean air zone forward in the timetable that we planned. It was delayed, if you recall, because the government is responsible for the technology for running the system, for the number plate recognition system. So we had to delay it, and Birmingham has been in the same position as us. But we are hopeful that we'll be able to get that up and running. I'm sorry, the exact date has gone out of my my mind at the moment.
I think January is the date.
I was say January, and then
yeah.
But obviously we haven't had the opportunity to have the conversation with government as to whether the technology will be ready. But it's obviously a very important part of what our plans.
So I think in the meantime, Judith, you know, other actions just to try and keep things as you know, to try and keep the quality as it is, I think would be a great step forward, wouldn't it? So I'm glad that, you know, you'd be prepared to consider you know, doing things that maybe were going to be part of the overall regime, but which can't now be introduced. Obviously the zone itself can't be introduced for some time, but some of the other things that were planned, again, could potentially be brought forward. So I think that's a useful message. There's a couple more things I want to cover, Judith, before we finish.
Okay.
So just sort of talking about the economy more generally, the city's economy, and how you think that is likely to pan out over the next few months and years. Again, you know, crystal ball time to an extent, of course, but I mean, what do we know? Well, we know that people are working from home. I mean, are you at home today, Judith?
Yeah, certainly am.
Yeah. I mean, people are working from home, and that pattern is not going to completely disappear, it seems to me. Even if people do go back to their working environments where they've not been able to do so far, they may choose to work the odd day at home. So I think the pattern of work is possibly going to change for good. The way that people, the high street, if you like, our shopping areas were already under threat before this. I think that may well have been accelerated. So how our city centre, which, you know, is something that Leeds has always trumpeted as being an attraction for visitors and people who live in the city, you know, that may well change. But more generally, the likelihood is we'll have one hell of a recession in the next few months. So how do you think, thinking about the council's inclusive growth strategy, for example, you know, what do you think we need to look at now as a result of COVID that perhaps we weren't looking at or weren't focusing on as much previously?
Well, if I can tell you that the strategy in terms of moving the city forward is still going to depend on the same principles. So the three key pillars: our climate emergency strategy, our inclusive growth strategy, and our health and well-being strategy. And I think actually the crisis we're going through just reinforces how important those three areas are. but I think you have to understand the severity of the economic forecasting that is taking place at the moment. We had a 62% increase in job seekers allowance, in universal credit claims, for example, in the last couple of months. The number of companies across West Yorkshire with high risk credit ratings has continued to rise, rising by 17% on the 28th of April to a number in May that come to 5,500. And I think it's these sort of figures that we have to realise just how difficult the economic future is of the country, so of the city. So the most important thing we're doing at the moment is working with companies. We've set up an economic recovery board. We're working at West Yorkshire level, at the city level. We've just had the Yorkshire Leaders Board last week, working at how we can come together to really address the challenges that are facing us and feeding into the economic recovery work that's happening at a national level. And there is really serious concern about the position that young people are in at the moment. And obviously, so many young people have had their education disrupted. We don't know how many who would have been going on into further or higher education next year will be doing so. We don't know what state our universities will be in, our colleges, or businesses with apprenticeships. All of these areas that affect young people so directly are under our consideration. So the inclusive growth part of what we do is absolutely critical. The other area that I touched on earlier is just recognising how the health inequalities that we face after 10 years of austerity and cutbacks has had on people's resilience and ability to fight off the virus is so marked that it's financial deprivation that is one of the key indicators of how people are going to recover. So I think in the first place, Martin, we really have to address the challenges that are being faced. But if you look at our cultural sector, for example, when can we hand on heart say that though all of the people who work in events, who depend on audience participation.
We've had a question about this actually, Judith, about live music and events. Yeah.
And then think of all the supply chain, the support for that, the hospitality, retail itself. How is retail going to respond to easing the lockdown? Are people going to have the confidence to come in and use the shops? And obviously, our retail outlets are really using creative means in terms of how they can safely attract people back in. But there are so many unknowns at the moment. So I think at the moment our focus is absolutely on the here and now, what companies are facing, what the prospects are going to be going through the summer, how many people are going to end up being unemployed as a result of this is going to be a massive and major factor in our ability to move forward.
I think that there's probably a period of, a shortish period, I guess, of analysis and consolidation required just to see what the situation actually is. And at the moment, it's obviously the furlough schemes are in place, and there's a degree of artificiality almost to things are being supported, but when those stabilizers are being removed, what actually happens? What will the place be like? And I think at that point, there are opportunities. Probably again, I use the word radical, but I saw on Twitter the other day that in Rotterdam, for example, they're giving over parking spaces in front of all the shops. So if you want the parking spaces as a shop, you can have it. And so shops have become market traders. again. They've gone back to where they were 100 years ago because
Mm.
that's safer than people going into the shops. So I suspect some of those innovative responses will and may well come from the businesses themselves, actually. Final thing then, Judith, because we're running out of time, I just wanted to go back to this issue of devolution and the proposed elected mayor next May. First of all, are you standing?
No.
Okay, that's easy. Second question, I wanted to ask you about the powers that are proposed. And again, does having an elected mayor, what role do you think that mayor will need to have as we come out of this crisis? Do you think it becomes more important a role as a result? Is it about money? Is it about powers? Is it about influence? What's your general view on this?
Okay, so personally, I start from the point of view that I didn't support the introduction of directly elected mayors. And as you know, Leeds went out to vote on this some years ago and soundly rejected the need for directly elected mayors. And I believe that we could move forward with the very strong relationships that we've got at a local level. So we have to make sure that the whole process of the election doesn't become a distraction, that it's something that is used positively for us to be able to promote what we have on offer. I think what the crisis has shown us actually is that where the levers of power, if you like, in terms of moving us through the crisis and actually doing things on the ground, are still very much in local government, and that's very evident in areas that have directly elected mayors already. But they do have they have the ability to pull the area together, to get the narrative for the area, to go out and promote the interests of the area. And I think that's the if you like, the strength of what a mayor can bring to the table. But it's going to be a very crowded year for elections next year, because with not having elections this year, we're going to have the Met elections, county elections, mayoral elections around the country, a mayoral election in West Yorkshire. Some areas are going to have PCC elections. It's going to be a real challenge, I think, to the patience of the public in terms of the position that they're in. So I think it's down to all of us to really get out there and promote what we have to offer locally, but also coming together at a regional level to really make the most of it, because we're going to be going into a very competitive time in terms of making sure that we get the investment that we need coming in, and making sure we're in the right place to be able to move forward into recovery. And the challenges are going to be immense. So the additional money and powers that we're going to get around the adults, the skills budget, for example, are going to be absolutely critical for us going forward. And I think we're all looking at this through a different lens now in terms of the crisis. I think, as I said, it was almost the last thing that we did before we went into lockdown was sign the deal. And just the change in the last 3 months has been immense. But really, it's just increased our resolve to work together to benefit our whole area. And the local resilience forum that's been working to help us through the crisis at West Yorkshire level has done an immense amount to help us make sure that we maximise the use of our talent and our everything that's at our disposal to help us through it.
We've had a couple of comments here, Judith, just to finish off about devolution. The view that more powers should be devolved from Westminster is one view. I suspect you would probably support that particular view. But also, and I think this is probably more because of the situation that we've had in recent months, the need to devolve more down to a local and community level. So it's not just about things going from London to Leeds, but actually things from going from the Civic Hall out to the communities. What would your view be on that?
Well, I'm always very struck at a slightly higher level than that in Scotland when I talk to, you know, other local authority leaders, and they say they don't believe that they've got devolution because, you know, it's devolved to the Scottish government, but, you know, they don't feel that it comes down to them as local authorities. And no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things we've got to really grasp coming through this is just how important it's going to be to work at a local level. And don't forget, we're still, as I've said all the way through this, living with the virus, and it could be that local geographical areas, local different sectors might be subjected to further outbreaks, and we have to make sure that there is a resilience running right down to local levels, so that we can, you know, that we can get organised at that level to cope and respond to anything that comes our way. But I accept that that's a very very close, you know, it is a widely held view that you know, for too long people have felt distant, and we must make sure that we don't replace at a West Yorkshire level the distance that has caused so much disaffection, if you like, from the remoteness of Whitehall. So I think that's a really important strand that we need to pick up and you know, work on now to make sure that we've got the mechanisms in place to keep that you know, the resources going right down to the neighbourhood level where they're needed.
Thanks, Judith. I think we're at the end of our time. I think this has been a really useful discussion, and I think, judging by the comments that we've had through, probably lots of unanswered questions in the time available, but also a lot of information that I hope people have found useful to understand where the city is currently. And there are a lot of uncertainties, as you rightly say, and it may be that another chat in a few months' time, when things are a bit clearer, it might be interesting to see how the city has changed. It's changed a lot in the last 3 months. You know, it'll probably change again in the next 3 months, I suspect. Thanks very much for joining us, and thank you everyone for joining us in listening in. As I say, we've got a number of these discussions taking place during the course of June. Rachel Reeves on Friday, so if you fancy listening to that one, then go on to Eventbrite, look up Rachel Reeves and it should pop up. But yeah, thank you once again, Judith. Thanks for joining us, and maybe we'll do a second leg in a few months' time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.